When Harold stepped out for his morning paper, the alley behind his house was gone, replaced by a tall iron fence that shouldn't be there. The metal glinted in the soft Arizona sun, stretching where the gravel path once ran behind his row of homes. The alley, lined with mulberry trees and the scent of morning dew, was now segmented by a fence so new the bolt still bore the shine of untouched zinc. Harold blinked once, twice, before descending the creaky porch steps. The soft brush of flannel against his skin reminded him of the jacket Eleanor had made, his name stitched with her careful hand above the pocket. He stepped closer, hand reaching to the cold bars, as if touch could explain it away. But it didn't. There was a plaque screwed near the base, "Private HOA easement, no trespassing." The font was too clean, too formal, as if it had anticipated resistance. A breeze swept past, rustling the golden leaves of October. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Harold didn't speak. He turned his head slowly, as if expecting Eleanor to be there beside him, clutching her mug and giving that sideways smirk she always had when bureaucracy overstepped. She used to call this alley their quiet escape route. The phrase played gently in his mind like the faint classical jazz drifting from the porch radio. He sat on the top step, the newspaper unopened beside him. His gaze lingered on the fence, studying the weld points, the spacing, the corners. It was shoddy work. Ben arrived mid-morning, carrying a half-full grocery bag and a worried look. "Grandpa, did you see?" Harold nodded once. "They put it up early. HOA trucks came just after dawn. Maureen's crew." Harold said nothing. Instead, he stood and walked to the side shed. Ben followed, concerned. "You're not thinking." But Harold was already inside, pulling out a canvas roll of tools. A wrench, a pry bar, the old socket set still greasy from the last mailbox fix. Ben exhaled. "Grandpa, please. Just, don't make this worse." Harold paused only to tap the radio dial as he passed the porch, just enough to sharpen the trumpet line. He wore the same expression he used to have when fixing radios for the Air Force, calm and unyielding. By midday, neighbors began to take notice. Mr. Verne peeked through his blinds, the glint of spectacles catching the sun. Children paused their bike rides to glance at the curious scene of an elderly man squatting at the base of a new iron wall, socket wrench in hand, undoing bolts one by one. The fence gave way slowly. Each section removed was laid neatly to the side. Harold moved with deliberate grace, his motions steady, shoulders squared. By sunset, half the alley was visible again. A thick envelope arrived in the evening mail. Ben read it aloud at the kitchen table, his tone shifting from formal to anxious as the words turned sharp: cease and desist. Unauthorized tampering of HOA property. Legal consequences to follow. Harold stirred his coffee. The chipped mug bore the faint emblem of his old unit, half faded but still proud. "I'll talk to them," Ben offered. "There has to be some way." But Harold only folded the letter, slipped it into the drawer beside Eleanor's old recipe cards, and said nothing. The HOA meeting was held the next afternoon in the community center. Beige walls, metal chairs, and the scent of old donuts. Neighbors filled the room in scattered clusters, some curious, others tense. Ben's mouse clicked twice, then paused on an odd listing, Lot 14B. $1,750. No bidders. The screen flickered for a moment, a lag typical of the town's aging zoning database. He leaned in, squinting at the parcel details. A sliver of land, 96 feet long, sandwiched behind a line of backyards, including his grandfather's. Zoning status, undesignated easement, surplus status pending. He blinked again. Could it be? The schoolroom was empty, the lights on motion sensors. Outside, the parking lot buzzed with the last crickets of early autumn. Ben drummed his fingers on the desk, debating whether to call Harold now or wait until morning. Instead, he copied the parcel number onto a yellow sticky note and logged off. Hours later, in Harold's garage, that note sat pinned among rusted screws and yellowing blueprints. Harold stood before the workbench, a map unfolded like a battle plan, his fingers tracing the alley. His old rotary phone sat on the shelf behind him, the receiver still warm from a call to the city office. Harold's gaze lingered on a penciled mark he had made decades ago, measuring where his property line ended and the town's began. The alley had always been peculiar, never properly paved, never snowplowed, but never patrolled either. Just used by everyone. Until now. Ben cleared his throat. I think it's a clerical oversight. Lot 14B isn't actually HOA property, it's town surplus. Harold didn't smile, but something softened around his eyes. We should double-check, Ben added. I called Samira. Samira arrived that evening. She wore a windbreaker dusted with concrete and held a thermos that smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee. She raised an eyebrow at the map, then tapped it with a ballpoint pen. Ben's right. It's a ghost lot. No HOA jurisdiction. No owner on record since '93. Town must have let it slip. Harold nodded once, then turned toward the small safe tucked in the corner. He opened it with practiced care and removed a leather envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, already filled out. Samira watched, impressed. You planned this? I planned for a lot, Harold said, sealing the envelope. Prescott City Hall was quieter than usual the next morning. The clerk, a man in his 40s with an affinity for small talk, raised his brows at the handwritten application. Lot 14B. That's been sitting on the books forever. Harold said little, except to confirm the amount. He signed in blue ink, placed the envelope on the counter, and waited. The clerk promised follow-up in a week. Harold nodded once and left. Back at home, the mailbox held a new surprise, another sign. It leaned arrogantly at the alley's edge, bigger than the last, HOA property, no entry, violators prosecuted. The fresh paint hadn't even dried yet. Harold fetched his oil can from the shed, gave the hinges of the back gate a patient touch, and returned to his workbench. He laid out his tools and resumed sanding the handle of an old spade. Jazz played faintly from the porch radio, a lazy brass solo stretching into the sunset. 2 mornings later, a plain manila envelope arrived by courier. The return address, Prescott Town Property Records. Harold didn't open it right away. He made coffee first, poured 2 mugs, one for himself, one in memory, and sat at the table with Ben. He unfolded the letter slowly. Inside, the official deed, a parcel map, and a seal in faint blue ink. Ben leaned forward. Is that? Harold read aloud, voice steady. I own the alley now. Ben laughed in disbelief. You actually did it. Harold slid the deed back into the envelope, placed it beside the salt shaker, and finished his coffee. Later that afternoon, the sun hung low and warm. Harold stood at the edge of the alley, where the new sign glared in the breeze. In his hand, he held an old hammer, its wooden handle smoothed by decades. He took a long breath of the crisp air, then smiled. Maureen stood at the front, flanked by 2 board members and a laminated poster titled Preservation Through Order. Her voice, cool and clipped, carried through the room. We cannot allow personal defiance to undermine collective standards. Mr. Green's actions constitute vandalism. Gasps. A few murmurs. Mr. Verne stood quietly by the back wall, arms crossed. Maureen pressed forward. This isn't just about a fence. It's about respect for the HOA's authority. Consequences will follow. She turned directly to Harold. You will regret this. Harold calmly said, I already don't. Overnight, a wooden gate appeared, elegant, arched, painted white, with a single word carved above, still ours. Dawn spilled softly over the rooftops of Prescott, painting golden streaks onto the dew-kissed alley. The gate stood proudly at the alley's entrance like it had always belonged there, its curve gentle and deliberate, its paint pristine. Brass hinges caught the morning light, and the antique latch shimmered faintly beneath a thin coat of oil. Ben stood across the street with a travel mug in hand, blinking at the sight. He didn't need to ask who built it. The precise angles, the dovetail joints, the hand-sanded edges, all whispered of Harold's quiet craftsmanship. What surprised him more was the inscription. Still ours. Not a challenge, not a boast. Just a reminder. Neighbors slowed as they passed. Some offered nods, others only glanced before lowering their eyes. A woman walking her poodle paused, tilted her head, then moved on. Harold, already sweeping the walkway nearby, didn't speak. He simply adjusted the rake of the mulch near the gate's posts, making sure not a single edge strayed. Ben crossed the street. Grandpa, that's beautiful. But the HOA. Harold wiped his hands on his flannel and looked at the gate like it was still unfinished. I didn't ask permission. I asked the wood. Later that afternoon, a new envelope arrived, larger than usual, delivered by a courier who didn't meet Harold's eyes. Inside, a formal cease and desist notice, printed on embossed letterhead, bearing Maureen Tillman's signature in rigid strokes. The message was firm: remove the unauthorized structure or face legal proceedings. Harold folded the letter carefully and slid it beneath a stack of old National Geographic magazines. He didn't need to read it twice. By twilight, he stood beside the gate with a wooden plaque in hand. Carefully, he mounted it on the inside, just above the latch. The words read, temporarily closed for reflection. A nod, perhaps, to everyone and no one. The smell of cedar lingered in the air. Mr. Verne appeared a few minutes later, his steps slow, deliberate. He paused outside the gate, hands tucked into his jacket, eyes scanning every carved line and brass fitting. Looks sturdy, Verne said finally. Harold nodded. Had the hinges in a drawer since '92. Felt like time. You'll get more letters. Probably. Verne hesitated, his fingers grazing the edge of the plaque. You know. I built fences for a living. Never liked them much. Then you understand, Harold replied, this isn't a fence. Verne gave a soft grunt, then turned to leave. At the sidewalk, he paused and looked back, not at Harold, but at the word carved in the arch. Sunday morning brought a calm wind and the soft hum of jazz from the porch. Ella Fitzgerald's voice danced through the stillness as Harold, kneeling by the gate, dabbed oil onto the brass latch with a cotton cloth. Each motion was slow, reverent. He whistled along without noticing. Ben arrived late, carrying a bag of bagels and worry. I saw a couple of HOA reps earlier, he said. They were taking photos. Harold didn't stop his work. Let them. Ben crouched beside him. Grandpa, they'll try something. They can take pictures, Harold said calmly, I've already taken back the view. The gate creaked softly as he swung it open, then closed it again with a precise click. It fit perfectly, like it had always belonged. From across the way, Mr. Verne watched silently. As he turned to leave, he looked back at the plaque once more. Something shifted in his expression. Overnight, Harold had arranged the chairs himself, 8 of them, clean but mismatched, forming a gentle curve along the alley's edge. By the time the sun pushed through the golden maple branches, steam was already rising from a line of old ceramic mugs placed carefully atop a fold-out table. On a Tuesday morning, the HOA president arrived to find the alley, Harold's alley, lined with folding chairs and coffee mugs. He didn't look up when Maureen's car passed. He was adjusting a cushion on the third chair, patting it with the same care he once gave the calibration knobs in his old engineering shop. Classical jazz hummed from the porch radio, low but steady, like it always was. A breeze caught the edge of a newspaper on the table, flipping it open to the community section. The photograph of the white gate, his gate, sat there with the caption, A Quiet Victory. Maureen didn't step out of her SUV. She slowed just enough to notice the cluster of older neighbors sitting calmly, talking, sipping. She saw Martha's thermos, with its faded label, You Earned This. Samira had brought drawings, rolled in a rubber band, labeled West Utility, Alley Subgrid, 1992. And there was Harold, not presiding but present, porch sentinel turned social gardener. Ben arrived near mid-morning, backpack still slung over one shoulder. His eyes scanned the gathering with cautious admiration. He caught sight of his grandfather adjusting a worn cushion and offered a quiet nod. They didn't need to speak. Later that day, Samira confirmed again, the HOA's claims held no weight against a town-deeded property. She said it gently, not to rub salt into Maureen's pride, but as a civic fact. They can't enforce signage on something they don't own, she said, sipping black coffee from her old thermos. You did your homework, Harold. Back at the HOA headquarters, 3 rooms behind a dry cleaning shop, Maureen paced. Her inbox buzzed with silence. Phil hadn't shown up for the emergency meeting she'd scheduled. Neither had most of the board. The few who did arrive sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Outside, the alley took on a new rhythm. Phil began walking the neighborhood, clipboard in hand. He wasn't knocking on doors, just pausing when someone waved, noting comments, recording stories about how the alley used to be before all the fences. His expression stayed neutral, but there was something in the way he listened that said he wasn't just checking boxes anymore. That weekend, residents opened their mailboxes to find the same typed page, and signed. Is our HOA still serving us? Some folded it away. Others pinned it to fridges. A few whispered about who might have written it. Maureen responded with a bulletin, formal, legal, bristling with phrases like unauthorized gatherings and pending action. The font was bold, the tone louder than any actual voice. Phil tacked his response beneath it, just one line, written in cursive ink. Or maybe we've outgrown the rules. Twilight settled over the alley as Harold watered his planters. The leaves had begun to fall, forming soft piles against the chairs. The space wasn't just his anymore, it hadn't been for a while now. Ben stayed late that evening. As he stepped off the porch to head home, something caught his eye near the lamppost. One of the new HOA security cameras pointed directly at the gathering space. But it wasn't glowing. He stepped closer. The cable dangled, unplugged. The camera's eye was dark. And it wasn't the only one. The gate opened to a surprise, rows of potted herbs, a reclaimed bench, and a hand-painted sign, the HOA Garden. The alley had changed again, this time with softer edges. Where cracked concrete once gathered dust, thyme and rosemary now leaned gently in terracotta pots. Harold had placed them with a measured, spacing them as if still mapping circuits in his mind. The wooden bench beneath the cedar trees had been sanded, stained, and rescued from a sidewalk discard pile. It creaked a little, but in a comforting way, like it had stories. Ben arrived with a flannel blanket tucked under one arm. He didn't say much that morning, just stood by the herbs and breathed in. Smells like memory, he said eventually. Harold didn't answer. Instead, he knelt near the garden sign, tightening its rope. The painted letters were neat but slightly uneven, clearly done by hand. Above them, his wife's old wind chime sang gently, catching a slow wind. Word of the transformation spread quickly. On Saturday, Mr. and Mrs. Ramirez brought marigold seeds and an old blue cooler full of apple empanadas. Martha handed out mugs of cinnamon tea from a dented thermos. Samira knelt beside the planters, installing solar lights with a quiet efficiency, her sleeves pushed high. The post Harold stapled to the message board was short and hopeful. The HOA Garden, shared hours, Tuesdays and Saturdays. All welcome. Bring hands, stories, or snacks. Children from 2 streets over arrived with gloves too large for their fingers, giggling as they tried to press tulip bulbs into the earth. Mr. Verne, silent as always, affixed a bird feeder to a branch above the bench. No one asked him to, he simply nodded at Harold, who nodded back. Late in the afternoon, Ben found a folded paper on Harold's workbench. City Services Complaint Form, he read aloud. The handwriting wasn't Maureen's, but the language was unmistakable: unauthorized cultivation, possible zoning violation, improper waste management potential. There was no signature. Only the inked return address of the HOA's anonymous mailbox. Samira looked up from her blueprint. We'll file a motion, she said. Community shared non-profit use. They'll have to treat this like a park now. Harold sipped his tea. Then we'd better make it one worth walking through. By twilight, the garden glowed. The solar lights twinkled just enough to outline paths between planter boxes. People lingered. They swapped recipes. They shared stories about the block before regulations ruled the rhythm of their days. Martha suggested a Thanksgiving potluck in the alley, no RSVP, just pies and people. Ramirez offered to roast a turkey. Ben promised to bring his mother's cranberry chutney. Someone mentioned music. Someone else said, no speeches. Phil showed up after dark, his breath curling in the air. He didn't sit, just paced a little, then stopped near Harold. You may have started something bigger than fences, he said. His voice wasn't sharp. Just low and wondering. Harold didn't reply. He only looked toward the bench, where kids had left a row of tiny pumpkins with marker faces. As the evening faded and neighbors dispersed, Mr. Verne stayed behind. From his coat, he pulled a photo, black and white, curled at the edges. The alley in 1979. A dozen kids on bikes. A clothesline strung across. Chalk drawings on the pavement. He handed it to Harold without a word. The next morning, frost clung to the mailbox. Harold opened it with steady hands. Inside, a yellow envelope, thick with weight. Stamped across the front, HOA recall petition, signatures pending. The recall petition didn't begin with noise, but with flowers quietly left beside Harold's gate. A cluster of carnations, wrapped in wax paper, had been tucked beneath the latch one morning after the frost melted. No note. No signature. Just pink petals and a piece of twine. Harold stared at them longer than he meant to. He placed them gently in a chipped glass jar on the bench near the rosemary. The Holloway garden had grown without schedule. Now, rows of kale and pansies mingled under blinking strings of soft yellow lights. Martha had recently brought begonias, half laughing as she pressed soil around their roots. Told you, she said, this place needed less bylaws, more begonias. The alley no longer looked like resistance. It looked like hope with worn gloves and clinking mugs of tea. Inside homes across the block, the recall petition passed hand to hand like a sacred recipe. Phil had kept things quiet at first, but the momentum gathered naturally. A printed sheet in Mr. Verne's garage. A conversation by the mailbox. One neighbor murmured, finally, and another, about time. By the week's end, over 60% of residents had signed. At HOA headquarters, Maureen paced like a metronome wound too tight. Her latest newsletter was longer than usual and titled, The Misguided Allure of Rebellion. In the third paragraph, she named Harold explicitly, a manipulator cloaking disobedience in daisies. Ben read it aloud to Harold and cringed. Harold simply poured more coffee and folded the letter in half. Samira worked behind the scenes with her usual precision. She filed procedural paperwork with the city and verified the petition's legitimacy. Every box was ticked, every form notarized. She had even brought Harold a pen with the city seal on it, saying, it's ceremonial now. The HOA boardroom hadn't seen this many people in years. Its cheap linoleum floor squeaked under the weight of shuffling feet and wheeled walkers. The fluorescent lights hummed, but no one spoke until Phil stood. I hereby submit formal notice, he said, his voice steady. A recall vote shall be held under Article 7, Section 3 of the Charter. Maureen didn't respond at first. Her face twitched only when a man in the back muttered, let us choose. She straightened her shoulders. This is out of order, she snapped. No, Samira replied calmly, standing beside Phil. This is exactly in order. That night, Harold hosted a quiet gathering in the garden. No speeches, just stories. Neighbors shared memories under plaid blankets, passing slices of pumpkin pie on paper plates. An old man spoke of losing his dog once in that alley, and finding him again thanks to Harold's wife. A woman recalled the sound of wind chimes in spring. Laughter floated above the rosemary and lights. When the crowd had gone home, Harold stayed behind, lingering near the gate. His breath fogged in the cold as he adjusted the crooked handle of a folding chair. As he turned to go, he opened the mailbox out of habit. Inside, resting softly atop a pile of circulars, was a bundle of lilies. And beneath it, a folded square of paper, plain, off-white, no seal. He didn't read it then. Not yet. Later, after the chairs were stacked and the last pie crumbs shaken from the tablecloth, Harold walked the length of the garden alone. The wind was quieter tonight. Lights flickered, but held. The alley hummed with the breath of a space remembered. He reached the gate just as the sun had slipped away, leaving only a bruise of purple along the horizon. A single candle flickered beside the gate. Next to it, a note, "We're with you." The line for the HOA vote curled past the rose trellis, quiet as snowfall but twice as heavy. It began before sunrise, when the mist still clung to porch railings and holiday lights blinked half awake. Folded scarves covered mouths, but eyes glanced toward the community hall, then toward the gate Harold had built. A soft hush blanketed the neighborhood, as though even the wind held its breath. Ben stood at the edge of the lawn, a thermos of lukewarm tea in hand, watching. He remembered Harold's words from weeks ago, "You don't force change, you show what it feels like to belong." And here it was, children holding mittens, elders with walkers, couples in quiet companionship, all stepping toward a small box where choice lived. Inside, Samira ran the check-in table with the calm confidence of someone who had already double-checked everything twice. Her fingers, gloved and glinting with ink, guided pens to ballots, nodded at signatures, and collected envelopes into a steel-locked bin. She didn't look toward Maureen once. Maureen had set up a folding table to the side with a sign, "Coffee Appreciation Day, let's reconnect." It stood untouched for the first hour. A carafe of cinnamon brew cooled under the weight of silence. Martha passed by it with a slight smile and a homemade cookie tin, for Harold. Phil circled the front steps with quiet purpose, answering questions, explaining the recall process with short, respectful nods. "Yes, it's valid. No, it doesn't mean all rules are gone, just better ones coming." Harold, meanwhile, did not stand in line. He had no interest in becoming the center of gravity. Instead, he leaned quietly against the garden's archway, offering a small bundle of dried lavender to the little girl who once left him lilies. She tucked it into her coat, giggling. The Holloway garden shimmered behind him, now draped in strings of winter-white lights and ornaments carved from wood. A ceramic angel hung from a cedar branch. Mr. Verne had placed it there earlier that morning without a word. By noon, the line thinned. By 4, the hall had grown hushed again, ballots locked away. And by 6, the speaker crackled to life. A rustle moved through the crowd gathered outside. By member vote, Samira's voice read, firm and clear, "President Maureen Tillman is hereby recalled." Effective immediately. For a beat, no one spoke. Then came the sound, soft, almost unsure at first. A cheer. Then another. Hands clapped against coats, some wiped eyes. Even Mr. Verne, stoic as ever, tipped his cap and muttered, "About time." Maureen stood still, her clipboard lowered. She did not speak as she turned and walked toward the end of the alley, heels clicking too loudly. As dusk slipped in, neighbors lingered. Someone placed a speaker near the garden fence. From it came a gentle, almost whispered tune. "This land is your land, this land is my land." A woman approached Harold with a small notebook bound in worn leather. "From all of us," she said. Inside, handwritten names, little messages, and in the first page, "Thanks for showing us the way," without shouting. Harold nodded once and closed the book gently, as though folding a promise. Later that night, when the air had turned sharper and the last candles in the garden had flickered out, Ben found something waiting on the porch. A single manila envelope. No stamp. No name. He opened it slowly. Inside was a typed document. Notice of intent to pursue legal action, destruction of HOA property, lot designation 14B. Ben looked up toward the dark alley, toward the gate still standing. And his breath caught in the cold. Harold folded the lawsuit letter into thirds, slid it under the weight of his coffee mug, and stepped into the garden bathed in early winter light. The air held a crisp edge that promised snow but hadn't quite delivered. Frost clung to the lawn edges like a silver thread, and above, a robin chirped stubbornly from a leafless oak. HOA Garden, now officially named with a carved wooden sign, glowed beneath a delicate net of wire-strung lanterns. Tulips slept beneath mulch, waiting for spring. But people were blooming already. The weekly newsletter, typed neatly by Ben and folded into every mailbox, carried a small headline, "Lawsuit withdrawn, HOA moves forward." Below it, Samira's letter had been reprinted, "No evidence of damage. No further legal action will be pursued." Harold hadn't smiled when he read it. But he had nodded. And this morning, he quietly unscrewed the metal, "Private Property" sign from the gate and replaced it with one hand-carved from pine. It read, "Welcome to HOA Garden." By 10 o'clock, folding tables stood along the fence, covered in warm ginger tea, oatmeal cookies, peppermint bark wrapped in foil. Phil had organized it all, his new title as interim president pinned modestly to his flannel shirt. He didn't give speeches, not really, but when the neighbors gathered, he tapped his glass once and said clearly, "We won't be led by fear again. That ends here." Applause came not in thunder, but in a murmur of clinking mugs and small smiles exchanged across benches. Children hung hand-drawn snowflakes from the tulip fence. One little boy dragged a wagon full of candy canes, handing them out with solemnity. An elderly woman offered knitted socks to whoever would take them. Every few minutes, someone passed Harold with a nod, or a gentle "thank you" or a pie. Ben wandered through it all like a quiet scribe. He snapped a photo of the garden gate. Then of Harold, placing an old brown coat over his shoulders, the same one his late wife used to insist was the only decent jacket for cold mornings. That afternoon, a white envelope arrived at Ben's porch. Inside was a note from the town's mayor. "In recognition of your role in uniting this community and restoring public space, Harold Jenkins is hereby honored with the Prescott Medal for Community Peacebuilding." Ben read it aloud near the trellis. A hush fell, then someone called out, "Speech." Harold raised a hand, half smiling, and simply said, "You all did this. I just kept the gate from rusting shut." As people chuckled, a small voice piped up from behind. It was the little girl from next door, the one who had once given Harold lilies. She held out a folded piece of thick paper, decorated with crayon swirls and red glitter glue. On it, a wide garden gate drawn open, people walking through it holding hands. Above it, in looping, careful letters, "Thanks for letting us in." Harold took it like it was made of glass. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows between the lanterns and trees, Harold stepped to the base of the tulip bed. He held a slim wooden stake with carved letters and pressed it gently into the soil. It read, "This path belongs to everyone." He stood back. Ben watched, camera lowered. Behind him, laughter drifted from the tables, old friends and new neighbors toasting cider. From down the road, a car pulled up. A woman stepped out, arms full of moving boxes. She glanced toward the crowd, uncertain. Then she saw the gate. She walked toward it slowly, pausing at Harold's sign. Ben stepped forward. "Is this really free?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Ben smiled. "It always was. Some folks just forgot." The woman nodded, and together they walked through. As the holiday lights flickered gently across HOA Garden, the once divided neighbors now shared stories, laughter, and slices of warm pie. What began as a quiet stand against a locked gate became a movement for openness, understanding, and reclaiming what truly belonged to all. When rules are used with wisdom, they shelter communities; when abused, they only build walls. Perhaps it's never too late to unlock a forgotten gate, and in doing so, welcome each other back in. Like a garden left unguarded, kindness tends to grow best when no one tries to own the path.